Tonight, before you sleep, you will lock your door. You will not think about it. The deadbolt, the password on your phone, the little padlock in your browser that promises a stranger is not reading over your shoulder. You lock your chests, in a sense, exactly as your ancestors did, because some quiet part of you has never fully trusted the people on the other side of the wall. And yet you also live, every single day, inside an astonishing peace. You walk past 100 strangers who could rob you and do not. You hand your money to a bank you will never audit. You obey a government you complain about constantly and would fight to keep. Why? Why do we accept rulers we resent, taxes we hate, laws we grumble at, and cling to them the moment they wobble? Almost 400 years ago, in the middle of a country tearing itself apart, one grim, brilliant Englishman sat down to answer that question with a coldness that still shocks people. His answer was not comforting. It was this: strip away the state, the police, the courts, the whole invisible cage of order, and you would not find noble, free human beings. You would find a nightmare. His name was Thomas Hobbes. His book is called Leviathan, and it is the most clear-eyed, unsentimental account of power ever written. A book that explains, better than anything on your newsfeed, why you obey. This is Leviathan, in about 20 minutes. The book is Leviathan, published in 1651 by Thomas Hobbes. And to understand a word of it, you have to smell the smoke it was written in. Hobbes was an Englishman living through the English Civil War, the bloodiest breakdown of order his country had ever seen. King and Parliament went to war. Neighbours killed neighbours. In 1649, the English did something almost unthinkable. They put their own king, Charles I, on trial and cut off his head in public. The old certainties, the crown, the church, the natural order of things, all of it collapsed into blood and confusion. Hobbes watched much of it from exile in Paris, a careful, frightened man who once joked that fear and he were born twins because his mother went into labor on hearing the Spanish Armada was coming. That fear is the engine of the whole book. Hobbes was not a starry-eyed idealist dreaming of perfect societies. He was a man who had seen order die, and who wanted, above all else, to understand what holds it together and what it costs to keep it. He came to politics like a geometer, building his argument step by cold step from a single question. What are human beings really like when nothing at all restrains them? His answer founded modern political philosophy. Every later thinker who argued about the social contract, about rights, about why the state may command you, was answering Hobbes, agreeing with him or recoiling from him, but never once able to ignore him. And that is why the book survived. It was not loved. For centuries it was feared and denounced, called godless and monstrous. But it refused to flatter anyone, and a book that tells an ugly truth outlasts 1,000 that tell a pretty lie. Nearly 4 centuries on, whenever a society debates how much power to give its rulers, Hobbes is quietly in the room. Here is the whole book in one sentence. Leviathan says that human beings, left to themselves without a common power to keep them in awe, will tear each other apart. So they trade away their dangerous freedom to a single overwhelming authority. And that terrifying bargain is the price of peace. Hobbes's real subject is not kings, or God, or law for its own sake. His subject is fear, and the deep machinery by which fear turns a crowd of dangerous strangers into a functioning society. He wants to know where order actually comes from, not where we wish it came from, and what we must surrender to get it. And his answer, worked out with brutal logic, still describes the world outside your window, why states exist, why we obey them, and why the alternative frightens us more than the tyranny does. We will walk it in 5 beats. First, the state of nature, the war of every man against every man, and why life without order is unbearable. Second, the way out, the passions that quietly push us toward peace. Third, the covenant, the strange act by which a scattered multitude becomes one artificial giant. Fourth, the sword, why promises alone are worthless and power must stand behind them. And fifth, the mortal God, the immense authority we build and the bargain we are still making with it today. 5 beats, 1 frightened genius, and the coldest, clearest map of power ever drawn. Keep one thing in mind as we go. Hobbes is not trying to make you comfortable, and he is not trying to sell you a politics. He is trying to show you the machinery you are already living inside. The deal you signed without ever reading it. The reason a locked door helps you sleep. Every beat is a turn of that machine. First beat, the state of nature. Hobbes asks you to run a thought experiment that has haunted political thought ever since. Imagine every government gone. No police, no courts, no law. Just human beings, roughly equal in strength and cunning, all wanting the same scarce things. What happens? Not freedom, Hobbes says. Terror. Because if 2 people want one thing they cannot both have, they become enemies, and with no common power above them, each must strike first or be struck. Listen to how he names this condition. During the time men live without a common power to keep them all in awe, they are in that condition which is called war, and such a war as is of every man against every man. Not a war of army against army, a war of each against all, permanent, exhausting, where even the strong must sleep with one eye open. And in that world, Hobbes writes, nothing can be built because nothing is safe. There is no industry, no farming, no knowledge, no art, and in the most famous phrase he ever wrote, the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Sit with that. It is bleak on purpose. And before you dismiss it as ancient gloom, Hobbes turns it on you. When you travel, do you not arm yourself? When you sleep, do you not lock your doors? You already believe him. You already suspect that under the thin crust of order, this is what waits. That suspicion is where the whole book begins. Second beat, the way out. If Hobbes only told you how terrible the war of all against all is, he would be a mere prophet of despair. But he is really an engineer, and the state of nature is simply the problem he means to solve. So how do we escape it? Not through love, not through the goodness of our hearts. Hobbes has no faith in either. We escape through the very things that make us afraid. Listen. The passions that incline men to peace are fear of death, desire of such things as are necessary to commodious living, and a hope by their industry to obtain them. Read that again, because it is the hinge of the entire book. The same self-interest that drives us to fight also, once we think clearly, drives us to stop. We fear dying. We want a decent life, a warm house, food, the fruit of our own work. And we hope that by our own effort we can actually get those things, but only if the fighting ends. So reason whispers a way out. Lay down your weapons if everyone else will lay down theirs. Peace, for Hobbes, is not a moral ideal floating above us. It is the rational deal that frightened, ambitious creatures strike when they finally see that endless war costs far more than it pays. Hobbes calls the terms of that deal the laws of nature. But a deal is only words, and that, as the next beat shows, is exactly the problem. Third beat, the covenant. Here is the strangest and boldest idea in the book. To escape the war of all against all, Hobbes says, a whole multitude of people must do something almost magical. Each one lays down his right to govern himself and hands it to a single authority, one man or one assembly, on the strict condition that everyone else does exactly the same at the very same moment. It is a covenant of every man with every man, and in that instant something new is born. The scattered crowd fuses into one artificial person, one body with a single will, and Hobbes gives it the name that titles his book. By art, he writes, is created that great Leviathan called a commonwealth, or state, in Latin civitas, which is but an artificial man. Look at the frontispiece he had engraved for it, one of the most haunting images in the history of ideas. A giant crowned king rising over the land, and when you look closely, his whole body is made of hundreds of tiny people, all facing inward toward his head. That is the state. That is us. The Leviathan is not a monster from outside. It is the artificial giant we assemble out of ourselves the moment we agree to be ruled. Its soul, Hobbes says, is sovereignty. Its strength is the pooled power of every person who consented. We do not merely obey the giant. In the deepest sense, we are the giant, and that is exactly why it is so hard to escape. Fourth beat, the sword. So we make a covenant, we build the giant, and we all promise to keep the peace. Problem solved? Not remotely, and here Hobbes is at his most ruthlessly honest. A promise, he knows, is a fragile thing. The moment it becomes advantageous to break it, someone will. And once one person cheats, everyone must go back to arming themselves, and the whole war returns. So what makes a covenant actually hold? Not conscience, not goodwill. Power. Listen to the coldest line in the book. Covenants without the sword are but words, and of no strength to secure a man at all. Words are wind, Hobbes says elsewhere. A contract that nobody can enforce is worth nothing. For the peace to be real, the giant must carry a sword, a power so overwhelming that breaking your word becomes more dangerous than keeping it. This is why Hobbes insists the sovereign's power must be nearly absolute. Split it, limit it, hedge it about with too many checks, and you weaken the one thing standing between you and the war of all against all. Modern ears flinch at this, and they should. But notice what he has put his finger on. Every peace you enjoy, every contract, every border, every rule you trust others to follow, rests somewhere far underneath on the credible threat of force. The velvet glove works because of the iron fist inside it. Hobbes simply refused to look away from the fist. Fifth beat, the mortal god. Put the pieces together and you see what Hobbes has built, and how much it demands of you. The frightened multitude, fleeing the war of all against all, pours its power into one supreme authority, and Hobbes reaches for astonishing language to describe it. This is the generation of that great Leviathan, or rather, to speak more reverently, of that mortal God, to which we owe under the immortal God our peace and defense. A mortal God, an earthly power so great that, next to the naked individual, it might as well be divine. That is the state you live inside right now. It is why a government can tax you, conscript you, imprison you. Powers no single neighbor could ever claim over you, and you accept it because the alternative is worse. But feel the weight of the bargain. You are safe because something enormous holds a sword over everyone, including you. Hobbes's critics have argued with him for centuries. Is the price too high? What if the mortal God turns tyrant? Later thinkers would answer with rights, with elections, with limits. Hobbes distrusted, but none of them could unask his question. Every time you weigh liberty against security, at an airport, online, in a crisis, when people cry out for a strong hand, you are standing exactly where Hobbes put you, negotiating with the mortal God, deciding all over again how much of yourself you will trade for peace. So what does all of it add up to? On the surface, Leviathan is a dense 17th century treatise on sovereignty, written in a country soaked in civil war. But underneath the archaic spelling, Hobbes is telling one continuous, unnervingly modern story, and every beat we walked is a link in its chain. He begins in the state of nature, where equal, frightened people with no common power fall into a war of every man against every man, and the life of man becomes solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. He shows the way out, not through virtue, but through fear, desire, and hope, the very passions that push us to seek peace. He describes the covenant, that almost mystical moment when a multitude lays down its rights and becomes one artificial giant, the Leviathan assembled out of ourselves. He insists that this giant must carry a sword, because covenants without the sword are only words. And he crowns it a mortal god, an authority vast enough to hold the peace, and unsettling enough to make us argue about it forever. Put it together, and you get Hobbes's real gift. Not a love letter to tyranny, as his enemies claimed, but the most honest X-ray of power ever taken. He refused every comforting story about why we obey, and showed us the fear at the root of order. Leviathan endures not because we like its answer, but because we have never quite managed to escape its question. Read it once, and you can never again look at a police car, a courthouse, or a quiet, obedient crowd the same way. You start to see the giant everywhere, in the traffic that stops for a red light, in the tax you pay without a soldier at your door, in the strange daily trust that lets millions of strangers live packed together and not tear each other apart. Here is the one thing to carry out of this book and into your work. Hobbes teaches you to see the sword behind the peace. Most of us move through ordinary life taking order for granted. The working traffic light, the honored contract, the stranger who does not attack us, as if it was simply natural, the default state of things. Hobbes says it is nothing of the kind. It is an achievement, fragile and expensive, held up by a power that most of the time we never even see. So the next time you feel the pull of that old fantasy, that if we just tore down the institutions, if we swept away the messy compromises of the state, people would somehow live freely and well, remember what Hobbes saw with his own eyes when a country actually did tear itself apart. And then carry the harder half of his wisdom too. Because the mortal God that keeps you safe can also grow monstrous. The question every serious citizen must keep alive is the one Hobbes forces on you. How much of my freedom is this peace worth, and who holds the sword? Do not answer it once and forget it. Ask it at every airport line, every emergency, every moment someone offers you safety in exchange for control. That double vision, gratitude for the order that shelters you and vigilance toward the power that provides it, is the real inheritance Thomas Hobbes left you. Thomas Hobbes wrote Leviathan in exile, in fear, in the wreckage of a civil war, and made one cold, radical case that we have never quite managed to refute: that peace is not our natural condition, but our hardest invention, bought by handing terrifying power to a giant of our own making. He gave us the war of all against all, and the mortal God who ends it, the covenant and the sword, and asked us to hold the whole grim bargain in view: the safety and its price, the shelter and the fear. If this walk through Leviathan gave you something worth keeping, subscribe. A new classic every week, faithfully, in about 20 minutes. Next time, we leave the battlefields of political theory for the green fields and cruel judgments of rural England, and Thomas Hardy's Tess of the d'Urbervilles, the story of a young woman punished by society for a wrong done to her, and one of the most heartbreaking accounts ever written of how the world crushes the innocent. And tell me in the comments, when you weigh your own freedom against your own safety, where do you draw the line? And do you truly trust the power you have handed the sword to? I read every reply.